Obsession, a persistent, disturbing preoccupation with an often unreasonable idea or feeling or a compelling motivation. That was the opening line of the prosecutor's closing argument at Jeff Titus's trial, and it was the centerpiece of the prosecutor's theory of this case, that Jeff Titus was so obsessed with his land that the very thought of another man touching it without his permission was enough to drive him to murder. As we all know, the prosecutor told the jury, an obsession is always most intense when it's about something new. Like when you buy a new car and you park at the back of a parking lot away from all the other cars to avoid getting any dings or scratches. Or when you buy a new carpet and at first you're paranoid about not spilling any drinks on it. When something is new, that's when your obsession is going to be at its greatest. And so it was with Jeff Titus. His obsession with his property was at its peak during the very first few months he lived on it. It was necessary for the jury to believe that Jeff Titus had an all-consuming obsession with his land because it was the only way to explain Jeff's irrational behavior on the day of the murders, when the prosecutor alleged he left the Shepherd farm in order to sneak back to his property in Fulton. Indeed, the prosecutor told the jurors, quote, the feelings that compel Jeff Titus may be so far removed from your own experience that it's difficult for you to understand why he would leave Stan Driscoll behind in the woods. The jurors were cautioned that, quote, we'll never be able to understand how he could be so consumed about a piece of land and all the animals there. And that's why they shouldn't get too hung up on trying to understand how this crime could have occurred or why Jeff Titus had done it. The prosecutor told them, quote, you don't have to understand the reasons to know that he did. You can try to understand it, to understand everything, to make sense of it, but you won't succeed because it was senseless. The prosecutor wanted the jurors to believe that they could never make sense of this case because there was a problem with Jeff Titus. But there's another possibility too. What if the real reason the jurors could never make sense of the case is because there was a problem with the prosecutor's evidence? Hi, and welcome to Undisclosed. This is episode 7 of The State vs. Jeff Titus. My name is Rabia Chaudhry. I'm an attorney and author of A Non-Story, and I'm here with my colleagues Susan Simpson and Colin Miller.
Hi, this is Susan Simpson. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C., and I blog at The View from LL2.
Hi, this is Colin Miller. I'm an associate dean and professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law, and I blog at Evidence Prof Blog.
The level of obsession that the prosecutor describes in his closing arguments is clearly pathological, which, as Detective Ballard explains, makes parts of the prosecution's case even harder to understand.
The prosecutor's theory is that Jeff was so controlling of his land that he assumed there might be somebody hunting his land at that place, and he was going to go take care of them. Well, if you're that possessive of your land, why would you even leave it the second day of deer season to go hunt somewhere else if you think that somebody else is going to be a problem and get your deer?
Even once Jeff had left his property that day, he didn't have to stay gone. After hunting the Crandall farm in the morning and early afternoon, Jeff could have told Stan, hey, let's go back to my place. They're in his truck. Stan can't say no, so why pretend to decide to stay and hunt the Shepherd farm and then sneak back to Fulton without telling Stan?
To drive that distance during prime hunting time, and everybody knows me, when it's hunting time, I don't leave to go anywhere unless I absolutely have to. And to turn around and think that I was territorial, that I would drive all the way home because I felt there was somebody on my property. It's a bunch of hogwash. I hunted there the first 2 days, or two, and then turned around and went up to the farm where I've always hunted. And I get a deer that night. Where at my house, I never got none.
If Jeff has an obsession with his land, well, from talking to him, I'm not sure how you'd ever know it, because it'd be too drowned out by his obsession with deer hunting. That's not to say, though, that Jeff has no objections to strangers wandering onto his land, because he absolutely would object to that.
I mean, I've had guys that come down the state land, and then you can see where their markers are, and then I'd find them up there in my woods, and I say, well, no, you're on my private property. One guy was tracking a deer one time. I helped him look for the deer. If you shoot a deer and it comes on my property, there's a blood trail, you can track it. If you're on the edge of my land and a deer runs down the line, go ahead and shoot it. I don't care. But I don't want you out there hunting in my fields.
So, does this make Jeff Titus territorial? Jeff's cousin, Lola Hedges, doesn't think so.
Did he have a reputation of being territorial, of not wanting people on his land?
I don't think Jeff was territorial. I know on my land, we've got trespassers all the time, and I say, you want to turn around and walk right back the way you came in?
While Jeff Titus himself doesn't want trespassers coming onto his own property, it's a sin that he'll admit to having committed himself from time to time.
Where do you think you got the reputation of being territorial of your property?
I don't know. I just, I don't want people on my property unless they have a business to be there, I mean, there's times I go on somebody's, but usually it's when I'm tracking a wounded deer. But legally, I should go get permission on some of these. Legally, they could say, well, you were trespassing.
Jeff Titus's neighbor to the north, Ron Elwell, recalls a time that Jeff Titus once trespassed into his land.
One time he came right up through the woods, and because I happened to be in the house that morning, and I told him, don't do that again. I said, because I don't know who's coming up through those woods. And he never did it again.
What did he say?
When I told him that,
Yeah.
I don't remember what he said.
He didn't argue with you though, or?
No. Jeff and I, we always we got along fine.
As Jacinda and I got to see for ourselves over and over again, when you're out in the country and you're even just near someone's land, they're gonna want to know what you're doing there.
Nope.
Up here. Hold on. Hi. Sorry, sir. I'm trying to get cell service for a phone call.
What was that?
There's no one here.
Someone saw us parked on the side of the road, so he was walking down to see if we needed help. So we just told him we pulled over to get cell service.
Yeah.
It's nice of him to check.
Or he was being territorial, wondering who we were.
I know. I thought, is he coming to kill us, or is he...
I think he didn't like us sitting here until he found out why we're here. One time, we pulled up to a house that had about 5 no trespassing signs posted, including one very large one that said, "No trespassing, we're tired of burying the bodies."
No solicitors.
Oh.
No trespassing.
Oh. I'm doing it anyway.
Are we really trespassing? Like knocking on someone's door?
No. For the record, the people at that house were lovely. But the point I'm trying to make here is this. If we're looking at the question of whether or not Jeff Titus is territorial, it's important to establish a baseline. And for those of us who live in the city, it might be a little odd to hear people get so touchy over a neighbor straying across a property line, but for this area, there's nothing odd about it. In terms of farmers who don't want hunters on their land, he's pretty normal. There's
You've
nothing.
talked to how many people who have said the same
Yeah,
thing?
even the ones who don't like Jeff are but I wouldn't want someone on my land. I'm like, no shit.
Right. Yeah, the guy we talked to the other day.
He was like, yeah.
He's like,
I didn't want the guy monitoring the cell phone tower behind my property.
Yeah, he didn't even want the electric company coming
Walking
through his
across.
property.
Jeff is not abnormal in that respect. When you hear Jeff on the show describing how he doesn't want trespassers on his land, that's not him being territorial. Not in the way the prosecution meant it. The prosecution's case against Jeff Titus was based on a theory that he was very unusually territorial, and that he possessed a dangerous combination of traits. Titus, the prosecutor argued, was someone who experienced an irrational rage at the thought of someone touching his property. But he was also confused about the location of his own property lines. And this meant that Jeff Titus became murderously violent towards people who weren't even on his property at all.
The idea that Jeff Titus might be unusually territorial is something that came up early in the original investigation that was conducted by detectives Wersima and Ballard.
When you interviewed people on the street or people in the neighborhood, did they initially say, oh, you should look at Jeff, you should look at Jeff?
No, just that one guy.
Just that one guy?
Yeah. I think that's the Marks or whoever it was, trailer there. The guy that brought it up. Yeah, from what I recall, it was just him. And, I mean, it's pretty obvious he would jump out at you as being definitely a person of interest.
The man that Detective Wersima is referring to is Mark Davis, who in 1990 had been living in the trailer that was next to Jeff Titus's property. He was only there temporarily, though. The trailer actually belonged to his mother-in-law, and his wife and he had been staying there while looking for a place of their own.
So how long after the murders did the cops come talk to you? Do you remember, like right away? Or
it was.
That day?
It was very soon after. I think they kind of spoke. I don't know how my name come up, and if Titus, because the conflict of catching me in the woods, he brought it to light.
Mark Davis had guessed right about why the detectives had come out to see him back in 1990. It had been Jeff Titus who'd brought up Mark Davis's name to the investigators. Titus described him as someone who was a reckless shooter, and he'd mentioned how a couple days after the murders, he'd suddenly moved out of the trailer and left for Battle Creek. Though Titus wasn't the only person in the neighborhood who'd mentioned Mark Davis to the police. Ron Elwell, who owned the property to the north of Titus and to the west of Mark Davis's mother-in-law, had told Wersima that at around 1 p.m. on the day of the murders, he'd seen two guys behind Mark Davis's trailer. They'd been shooting off lots of rounds, he said. Elwell's best guess had been that they were sighting guns. When Wersima finally tracked Mark Davis down, Davis had told him that he'd been out hunting in the game area on November 17th, close to where the murders occurred. But he'd only been out there that morning. He hadn't been out there in the evening when the murders happened. He also explained that he liked to do a lot of target practice there in the woods behind his trailer, which explained why he'd been doing all that shooting. And Davis told Wersima that he thought Jeff Titus was a little bit territorial.
Being that basically in that same corner, he confronted me when I was out squirrel hunting, and it happened in that area right there.
When he confronted you, were you on his property or on the state?
I think we was weaving back and forth. Actually, he was in the process of putting up new signs, no trespassing signs.
The patch of forest that Mark Davis had been squirrel hunting on was on Titus's property. And to make sure there was no further confusion about where the public land ended and the private property began, Titus had been in the process of making sure that everyone was absolutely clear that this was his property by installing no trespassing signs.
So you remember there being signs, no trespassing, up at the time of the murders?
Yeah. He had them up quite a ways, and he made sure to let me know they were bulletproof because he didn't want anybody to shoot them off the tree.
Sounds like him.
Yeah, it's just one of them things you go, okay, if you need bulletproof, keep out signs, okay.
It's not hard to see why Mark Davis would have gotten the impression that Jeff Titus was territorial. But there hadn't been anything tense or hostile about his encounter with Titus, either at that time or at any time later on. In fact, the next time that Mark Davis had seen Jeff Titus had been when he'd stopped by his house to bring him a gift. Well, a gift of sorts, anyway.
That was my only, him coming to the house with the squirrel was the only real encounter I had with the gentleman.
So why'd he come to your house with a squirrel?
Because he saw me out squirrel hunting.
Oh, so he's like, do you want this?
Yeah, he's like, I got my trap line, do you want it?
Oh.
So I didn't think anything of it.
Yeah, I guess if you're not used to trap lines or hunting, it might sound weird, but in context, it's...
If all of this is sounding like no big deal to you, well, it seems like the cold case team might have felt the same way, because they did not ask Mark Davis to testify at Jeff Titus's trial. However, they asked Mark Davis to come in to testify at Titus's preliminary hearing shortly after Titus's arrest.
That's just why I was curious about why they didn't even bother with you.
Probably because I was, from what they were saying, I was probably one of the few people that had a non-threatening conflict with him in the woods.
So the police told you that, did they expect your story to be more conflict, or?
What they were saying was anything relevant to that was never a good ending. He would never come over and offer, hey, I got this, would you want it? It was, don't ever come back here again, or I'm gonna, there's going to be consequences and things like that. And
so they were telling you it was surprising that he was so friendly after.
Yeah.
I guess
it was not something that anyone else had expressed that kind of interaction with him.
In the cold case team's view of things, Mark Davis had been an exceptionally lucky person. Not only had he trespassed into Jeff Titus's land and somehow survived, he'd also managed to get a squirrel out of it. No other trespassers that encountered Titus, they said, had been as lucky as Mark Davis had been.
Aside from Mark Davis, the only other evidence that the original detectives found that might suggest Jeff was unusually territorial had come from a few tips that had been called in to the police tip line. One of these tips had been from a man who said that, quote, on the 17th, between 12 and 1 p.m., he was at the Marathon station north of Athens, and while in the store, he overheard the lady that works there mentioning to a guy that she had seen some people on his land, and he'd gotten mad. He said he was going to go out and scare them off. And he said something like, I'm going to take care of this. I don't care if I go to jail or not. A few days later, another tip was called in about the same incident at the Marathon in Athens. And this second tip said, quote, the guy who found the gun was in a party store near Fulton before the shooting and said, if I catch anyone hunting on my property, I would shoot them. So Detective Worsama had gone to the Marathon store in Athens to investigate further. There, he talked to the woman who'd been working at the store on the day of the murders. Yes, she told him she remembered the incident that the tips had been called in about. She had been working on the 17th when a local landowner she knew, a guy named Terry, had come by the store. She told him how some hunters who had permission to hunt on Terry's land had come by earlier and mentioned that they'd seen some strangers out hunting on Terry's land. And when Terry heard this, he became upset and left the store saying that he was going to take care of it. Detective Worsama's report on this incident concludes, quote, the information found totally unrelated to the homicide or Titus, and apparent assumptions were made by the callers. The tipsters who called in about this incident hadn't even known Jeff Titus. They'd only heard about him from the Kalamazoo Gazette article about how Jeff had found the victim's missing shotgun. And based on the article, they somehow concluded that Jeff was the farmer they'd overheard threatening trespassers at the Marathon store.
A few days after the murders, a man named Richard Adams called into the sheriff's department with another tip. He'd been hunting in the Fulton game area back during bow season, he told them, at a spot not far from where the murders had occurred, when a man had approached him in the woods. In Richard Adams' estimation, this man had been in his mid-20s. He was about 5'10", had a mustache, and was wearing jeans and a camel coat. He carried a Remington 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. When Richard Adams had explained to him that he was going to be hunting there, the man had told him that probably would not be a good idea. Although the man's tone had not been overtly threatening, Adams had interpreted his words as a request for him to leave the area. So, Adams had left. The man had made him feel uncomfortable, he said, like he was trespassing or something, and he decided to get out of there. After hearing this story, Detective Worsama told Richard Adams to get a copy of the Kalamazoo Gazette and flip to the Metro section. There's a photo of a man there, Worsama said. Is this the man who approached you in the woods? Richard Adams did as instructed, and then called Worsama back. No, he said, that's not him. The photo had been of Jeff Titus, from the article the Gazette had run about how he'd found the missing gun. Whoever Richard Adams had seen in the game area had not been him.
But Rich Adams, he saw a picture of you and said it was not you. But I do believe he saw someone back there. He talked about a guy with a mustache. Do you have any guesses who that could be?
A guy with a mustache or a guy with a mustache and a beard?
One of those.
Well, if you have a mustache and a beard, it'd be Alan Stanton.
Alan Stanton's family owned the property to the south of Titus, and from time to time, he'd been known to have gotten upset at trespassers that he'd found on his land. And Stanton always had a mustache or a beard, as Richard Adams had described. The thing is, though, in Richard Adams' very first statement to the police, he described the guy he encountered as mid-20s. That's too young to be either Jeff Titus or Alan Stanton, whose family owned the property to the south of Jeff's. Though there's someone else in that area that might fit Richard Adams' description. Mark Davis, the squirrel hunter. There were other people too who had found their interactions with him in the game area to be uncomfortable. Big Jack Warren's daughter Kelly is one of them. Kelly Warren often hunted on Jeff's property and in the neighboring land in the state game area. She'd even hunted there the first year that Jeff moved into the place before the murders occurred. And she remembers someone in the woods who, from her description, could only have been Mark Davis.
But there was a guy he lived next door to Jeff.
Like right next door, up the road?
He would walk through and shoot his gun. I don't know if it was a .22 or it was a small caliber. Like he always would say, I'm squirrel hunting. But he didn't like the hunters and coming up through the Fulton Side game area because his property ran right next to Jeff's. And he backed up to that, and that irritated him to have hunters out there. So he would go through and talk real loud and shoot his gun. He wasn't brave enough to come up and say anything to you, but he would make it be a nuisance so you couldn't hunt. But the other thing is he wasn't aiming at anything when he would shoot. He would just fire his gun randomly.
Based on the evidence that the original investigators found about Jeff Titus's run-ins with hunters, it's hard to see how you can make a case that Titus was pathologically obsessed with his land. You've got Mark Davis's squirrel story, and Richard Adams saying that someone made him uncomfortable in the game area about a few hundred yards from Titus's property line. But that's it. The thing is, though, when the cold case team decided to go ahead and arrest Jeff Titus in 2001, that's all the evidence they had, too. That's why they had to bring in Mark Davis to testify at the preliminary hearing, because he was the only example they had to go on of a hunter being confronted by Jeff Titus. But if asking someone not to hunt in your land without permission is evidence of a scheme to commit murder, well, pretty much everyone in rural Kalamazoo County ought to be behind bars right now. Luckily for the prosecutor, though, in the months between Titus's preliminary hearing and his trial, the cold case team found 4 brand new witnesses that they'd somehow overlooked before, but who were now willing to testify that Titus had engaged in a disturbing pattern of threats and aggression against hunters he encountered in the woods. With these 4 new witnesses, along with a refurbished statement from an old witness, the prosecutor finally had something to work with in making his case against Jeff Titus.
At this point in our series on Jeff Titus's case, you've heard all the evidence that directly ties Jeff Titus to the murders at the Fulton State game area. You've heard about how he found the missing shotgun, when the police had not been able to do so. You've also heard about the witnesses who say that Jeff Titus made inconsistent statements about what he did with that gun once he found it. And you've heard about how Bonnie Huffman testified that she'd seen Jeff Titus at her parents' house at a time that contradicts his alibi. And as far as the evidence goes that links Jeff Titus directly to the murders of Jim Bennett and Doug Estes, that's pretty much it. Most of the prosecution's evidence in this case was not evidence about how Jeff Titus committed the crime he was charged with. Instead, the prosecution's case was largely based on evidence about things that Jeff had said and done in the years after the murders. Things that, according to the prosecution, prove he would have been capable of murdering Doug Estes and Jim Bennett. And a lot of what the prosecution used to make this case was what's known as Rule 404B evidence, evidence of other crimes, wrongs, or acts by a defendant. And in this case, the Rule 404B evidence was witness testimony about how on 4 different occasions, Jeff Titus had confronted hunters either on his property or out in the game area. These 4 encounters, the prosecution argued, were the proof that Jeff Titus had both the motive and the intent to kill Doug Estes and Jim Bennett. They were also proof that Jeff Titus had a modus operandi, and that the murders of Bennett and Estes so closely matched Jeff Titus's MO that it was reasonable for the jury to infer he had been responsible for their deaths. At Jeff Titus's trial, the prosecution was successful in making this case. As one member of the jury remembers it, the Rule 404B evidence had been convincing.
He had a long history of kicking people off of the game area. It butted up against his property. There were many encounters with him. One encounter was he was in the National Guard, so he had his camouflage clothing. He was all face painted up camouflage, and he had an AR rifle, an assault rifle with him. And he was going around finding these hunters on state property, the game area, and he's taking them off, dressed up in his combat clothing.
Like not on his part of the woods.
Carrying an automatic weapon with him.
The first 404B witness the prosecutor called was Richard Adams, who testified that one day back in 1990, while he was bow hunting out in the Fulton game area, Jeff Titus had approached him. Jeff had been wearing military camo and had a scruffy beard, and he told Adams that he was on private property and needed to leave. Adams said that he told Jeff Titus no, he was on state land and he wasn't going anywhere. At which point, Jeff had begun screaming and hollering at Adams to get the hell off his property. Jeff then began waving his Remington pump-action shotgun around before finally pointing the barrel right at him, at which point Richard Adams agreed to leave the area. And no, there are not two people named Richard Adams in this case. This is the same Richard Adams you heard about earlier in this episode, the one who in 1990 had told Detective Worsamont that the man he encountered in the game area had not been Jeff Titus. But in 2001, when he was interviewed by the cold case team, Richard Adams' story had changed in a number of ways from what he had first told Worsamont all those years ago. He now claimed that he'd always known the man who approached him in the woods had been the owner of the Titus farm, because he'd seen the man driving around the Titus farm before in a red pickup truck. And then when he saw news coverage of Titus's arrest on TV, he recognized the photos of Titus as the man who confronted him all those years ago. This had been the first time Richard Adams said that he had ever seen a picture of Jeff Titus. It's worth noting, though, that although Richard Adams identified Jeff Titus at trial as the man who'd confronted him in the woods, not much else about his description seems to match Jeff. Titus's truck was not red. Jeff Titus did not have a mustache or beard in the fall of 1990, and Jeff did not have a Remington pump-action shotgun. In fact, Jeff Titus did not use a pump-action shotgun at all. He used a Browning A5 semi-automatic.
I don't know why Richard Adams changed the story, and I don't know why no one at the trial bothered to mention the fact that his testimony had changed, and dramatically so. Prosecutor Scott Brower declined to speak to the documentary team, so I don't know why he decided to call a witness who had inexplicably changed the story from exculpatory to incriminating. Was he hoping that the defense wouldn't notice that in his first statement, Richard Adams had said the man wasn't Titus? Or did he think that if the defense did notice, he could still somehow rehabilitate Adams' testimony and convince the jury that his ID in 2002 was somehow more reliable than his ID in 1990? Titus's defense attorneys also declined to speak to me, so I can't ask them why they didn't attempt to impeach Richard Adams with a prior statement. Maybe they never bothered to read through all the police reports, so just never noticed the one from Racema in 1990. That's the only explanation that I can think of. And I can't ask Richard Adams why he testified the way he did, because, as I found out later, he died a few months after Titus's trial. He wasn't easy to find, though. When I was first trying to learn more about him, it was like trying to track down a ghost. It was as if Richard Adams had somehow gone through life without leaving the kinds of footprints that almost all of us leave behind, on databases and in faint online traces. The only real clue I'd had to go on was from his interview with the cold case team in 2001, when he'd said that he knew lots of people who'd had problems with Jeff Titus in the Fulton game area. When the detectives asked him who these people were, the only name he could come up with was that of one of his stepsons. So the cold case detective had tracked down the stepson and asked him about this encounter in the game area he'd supposedly had. But the stepson had told him, "I don't know what you're talking about. Nothing like that ever happened to me." I have not been able to speak to that particular stepson, but I did find his brother, and when I asked about their stepfather, Richard Adams, he responded, "Wait, you mean Dick Lehue?" That, it turns out, is the name that Richard Adams had actually gone by. As far as I can tell, Richard Adams was a name he'd used on paperwork at some points in his life, along with the name Richard Van Lacy. But Dick Lehue was what he'd been known as in 1990. And according to his obituary, Dick Lehue was the name he went by in 2003 when he died. The stepson that I spoke to had been living in Kalamazoo in 1990 and was still in contact with Dick Lehue at that time. That made me hopeful that he might know something about this case after all. I asked him if he thought that if Dick Lehue had an aggressive encounter with someone while out hunting, well, would that have been the kind of thing that he'd have told his stepson about? The stepson told me that it'd be tough for him to say, because his stepdad probably would have told him about it, but he'd have just as likely tuned it out. Because, he said, Dick Lehue was the kind of guy that always had controversy. Always had something going on. Well, he never had a job going on as far as the stepson knew, but he'd always had conflicts of one sort or another. Conflicts with the neighbors, conflicts with strangers on the street who'd looked at him funny, conflicts with people on the road who out of the blue had tried to run him over. Everything that could happen would happen to this guy, it seemed. In sum, the stepson said, Dick Lehue was drama, drama, drama. And oh, he added, I wouldn't trust a thing that came out of his mouth. The second 404B witness that the prosecution called was Bonnie Huffman. Yes, the same Bonnie Huffman, who originally told police that she'd seen Jeff Titus 8 or 9 on the night of the murders, but then at trial said she'd seen him a little after 5 p.m. When she was first interviewed by the cold case team in April of 2002, the detectives asked her if she'd ever had any problems with Jeff Titus, and she said yes, actually she had. It had happened in the fall of 1990, shortly after the Titus family had moved into the farmhouse across the street. She'd been deer hunting on her parents' property, she told the cold case team, and she'd climbed into a large tree to sit and wait for deer to come by. This tree was on her parents' land, though it wasn't far from where their property bordered the Titus farm. Out of nowhere, Bonnie said, Jeff Titus had appeared and pointed a pistol directly at her. He told her she was on his property and she needed to get off. At trial, Bonnie testified that he'd been waving his pistol around and telling her over and over again that this is my property, you're on my property, this is my land. Bonnie tried to tell him it was her parents' land, but he wouldn't listen, so she'd climbed out of the tree and gone back to her parents' house to tell her dad about what had happened.
She says when she was on her father's property, which would have been on the east side of 46th Street in the back, there's a large tree that she would go out and sit.
Right. I know which one tree.
You know which tree she's talking about?
Yeah, I know which tree she's talking about. It's right where my field ends. There was a big tree there, and that's where I saw her one day.
Now, do you think you could have said to her, hey, you're on my property?
No, because I know where the property was.
According to Bonnie Huffman and her mother, Pat Burnworth, Jeff Titus was forever confused about where his own property lines were. He didn't know what land was his and what was not, and that's why he was always getting into conflicts with hunters. He thought, falsely, that the portion of the Fulton State game area that was behind his fields actually belonged to him. There's another reason I can think of, though, for why Jeff Titus might have talked to Bonnie Huffman that day. And it's one that I find much more plausible than the idea of Jeff Titus not knowing his own property lines. Because the way Bonnie describes how this encounter began, with her sitting in a tree with a shotgun hunting deer in September, well, she would have been breaking 2 laws. She would have been illegally hunting out of season and illegally hunting from a tree. Yeah, that's something that Jeff Titus might have said something about. Because Jeff, well, he can be kind of a narc. And by his own admission, when he sees people who are breaking the rules or not observing what he believes to be proper gun safety practices, he doesn't keep his opinions to himself.
There was people I would run into, and we chit-chat and stuff, and they said, well, you're on private property, where it was on mine or it was on Holidays. There was one I ran into a kid that was down there by the state land, but he was on Holidays, and I said, well, this is private land. And that's when the kid had his gun with the barrel pointed down in his toe. And I said, that's not very good gun practices, because that gun could go off. You never know. And then he got rather irate with me because I was correcting his son.
As for Bonnie's claim that Titus pointed a pistol at her, and that she told her dad about it? Well, as Jeff Titus points out, there's a clear reason to be skeptical about this part of the story. Bonnie's testimony that Jeff Titus pointed a pistol at her and that she told her dad about this is also hard to reconcile with some of the other evidence in the case.
Did you ever point a gun at Bonnie?
No. I know she says I did, but I didn't. Now, let me ask you this. She said I did that. Now, I still went down to their in-laws' house. Now, would you let me in your house if I did something like that? If I pointed a gun at your dad or your daughter or whatever?
Right.
Would you let me in your house?
At the time that Bonnie Huffman first told the story to the cold case team in 2002, her mother, Pat Burnworth, had already been interviewed by the police on at least 3 different occasions. She had also already testified at Titus's preliminary hearing. But Pat Burnworth had never once mentioned the story about Jeff Titus pointing a pistol at her daughter. She had never suggested that there was any sort of rift between the families, or that Titus would not have been welcome in her home because of threats he'd made. The only complaint that Pat Burnworth ever makes about Titus in any of her police statements comes from her first interview with the cold case team. The report from that interview states, quote, Burnworth stated that Titus got so friendly with them that he was coming into their house without knocking and going through their cupboards looking for food, etc. She stated that they never used to lock their doors, but they began having to do so after that. I feel like I ought to note here, just for the record, that I've seen nothing that could corroborate Pat Burnworth's claim that Titus had a habit of strolling into her house and rummaging through her kitchen like some kind of oversized raccoon. And she never again mentions this whole cupboard rummaging thing. But what I have to wonder is this. If Titus had pointed a gun at her daughter, why would Pat Burnworth's only complaint about him be that he was too friendly?
The third 404B event occurred in 1991, and for this one the state called 2 separate witnesses. Both Ted Whitby and Chris Whitby testified about an encounter with Jeff Titus that had occurred on their family's annual hunting trip to the Fulton game area. The cold case team had first learned about the Whitbys' encounter with Titus in 2002, 1 month after Titus's arrest, when Ted Whitby had contacted them and told them about how his nephew Chris had once had his life threatened by Jeff Titus.
In 1991, when all this happened, Chris Whitby had only been 17. At trial, he testified he'd been out hunting in the Fulton game area with his stepfather and 2 uncles, out in the east side of Bear Creek, and he'd shot a deer. The deer hadn't gone down immediately, though. It had run off into a cornfield that bordered the game area. That cornfield was private property, but both his stepfather, Clayton Felthoff, and his uncle, Andrew Holt, had told Chris Whitby to go ahead and track the deer anyway. So he'd gone after it by himself. After a little while, Chris said he was done with tracking the deer and headed back to his uncle's. As Chris was leaving the cornfield, a man had walked up to him and asked what he was doing there on his property. And this man had his shotgun pointed right at Chris's chest. So that according to Chris, he was a little nervous. At that point, Chris's family had walked up in the scene and demanded to know what the hell the man was doing, pointing a gun at Chris like that. That's when Chris testified the man had told him they were trespassing on his land.
Question. Tell me about what it was that he told you or said to you.
He had said he'd been having a lot of problems, I guess, with hunters going onto his property and trespassing. He told me that he'd been getting very upset with everybody going on his property. If he was to catch me on his property again, he'd take it in with the law or whatever. Fine and dandy. I mean, it won't happen again, you know.
Chris said it wasn't until his stepdad, Clayton Felthoff, and his uncle, Andrew Holt, had started arguing with the man that he'd finally pointed his shotgun away from Chris's chest. And then the Whitby group had left the cornfield and headed back to their camp for lunch. Chris Whitby didn't explain what had happened to the deer he'd shot. Apparently his encounter with the man in the cornfield had made him forget all about the wounded deer he'd been tracking.
Ted Whitby, Chris's uncle, testified about the same event, though his memory of the encounter is noticeably different from his nephew's. According to Ted Whitby, he and Clayton Felthoff and Andrew Holt had all met up at the camper for lunch, when the 3 of them suddenly realized that Chris Whitby was missing. They went back to the game area to look for him, and when Ted Whitby heard loud voices arguing in a cornfield, he headed towards the sound, where he told the court he'd found a man in a cornfield who was holding his nephew at gunpoint.
And I asked Chris, I said, "Chris, what's going on?" He said, "This guy got a hold of me here for trespassing." And the guy's standing there facing Chris, and the guy's got a shotgun waist high aimed in Chris's direction. And I told him, "This ain't no way, you don't need to be holding no gun on him, he's just trespassing." Something of that nature. And he was, the guy, ornery, pissed off, bad attitude. And, remarks was exchanged, and I told Chris, "Come on, let's get up out of here. We'll go back to the camper."
So Chris had climbed back over the fence marking Titus's property line, and the whole group had returned to the camper. Later, Ted Whitby said he had talked to some neighbors and learned from them that the man in the cornfield had been Jeff Titus.
Jeff Titus doesn't remember all the encounters in the state game area that the prosecution claims he had been involved in. But this encounter with the Whitbys in the cornfield, well, that he still remembers clearly.
And then I think they were the same ones that me and my wife ran into, the Whitbys and the Fedoffs and Andy Holt. And they were the ones that were in my cornfield. And they told me to stay where I was at. We've got a deer out here in the corn, a wounded deer. And I says, "You do?" And they said, "Yeah." And then I left my wife with the one. I walked over to the one by the state land, talked to him. I said, "Are you with the guy out there in the cornfield?" And he said, "No." Then I walked out to the guy in the cornfield. I said, "Are you with them guys over there?" And he said, "Yes." And I says, "Well, let's go over there." And we walked over there, and then the other guys all come over. My wife come over, and I says, "This is my land." I says, "I have 2 kids. And I says, I don't want you hunting on it." I said, "If you're on the state land and you wound a deer and it comes on mine, you can go ahead and look for it. But I said, the one you said you shot, there's no blood." I said, I looked right where you said the tracks were. There was no blood trail."
Jeff Titus didn't testify at trial, but his wife Julie did, and she remembered the events the same way that Titus described them here. And there's no doubt that Julie Titus was there to witness this event. On cross, both Chris and Ted Whitby had acknowledged that Jeff had not been alone in the cornfield. There had been a woman with him, they said, and she had stood there and watched as Titus had held Chris Whitby at gunpoint. But according to Julie Titus, that's not what had happened. She and her husband had been out hunting when they'd seen someone in their cornfield, someone who was very close to their farmhouse, which was unsettling because the cornfield was sizable, running about 370 yards back from the Titus farmhouse to the wood line that abuts the game area. And yet this hunter was nearly in their backyard, where their 2 daughters often played. He was very close.
And I said, "I don't want you hunting on property." I said, "I've got kids up in the house. And you're walking out in the cornfield, and if you don't know where the house is, you fire a shot up there. And my kids may be out." And that's what I said to him.
The Whitby hunting party had 4 members in it, but the jury had only heard from 2 of them at trial. There was a member of the hunting party who had not been called to testify.
I think his name was Andrew or Anderson or something like it. He worked at a religious counseling center or a county counseling center or something like that over in Kalamazoo. Because I met him in the jail. He come through on tours with a religious group. And he said, you were perfectly nice and cordial."
The man that Jeff Titus met in jail was Andrew Holt, Chris Whitby's uncle. He declined to be recorded for the podcast, but he was willing to speak to Jacinda and Susan about what he remembered.
When I spoke to Andrew Holt, he started off by telling me about the interview he'd had with the cold case team back in 2002, when they called him in to talk about the incident in Jeff Titus's cornfield. He'd told them what he remembered, but when he was done, the detective said, "Your statement seems a little benign compared to the others." Andrew Holt had not been called to testify at Jeff Titus's trial. His story was too benign, I guess. Jeff Titus only learned about Andrew Holt after his trial was over. Holt had volunteered for a prison ministry group, and one day after Titus was convicted, Holt had gone up to talk to him.
And Andy Holt turned around and told me later, after I got convicted, he said, "Titus, I had to avoid you because I was going to be called or whatever," but he never was. He said, "You were perfectly nice and cordial."
Yep. We talked to him.
Did you talk to him?
We talked to him.
Talked to him.
That's what he told us, too.
But yet the rest of them said that I was belligerent and pointing the gun at him and so forth.
Andrew Holt had been part of the Whitby hunting party back in 1991, and camping with them in their trailer off of X Avenue. During the first few days of that season, Holt had actually run into Jeff Titus at one point while out in the game area. Titus had been hunting there as well, and when they'd run into one another in the woods, they'd had a brief, friendly conversation, and then they'd gone their own ways. The second time Andrew Holt saw Titus had been about a week later. It was after he and Clayton Feltoff had seen a group of deer run to the cornfield east of the Fulton game area. That's when, he told me, they did something they knew they shouldn't have done. They sent 17-year-old Chris Whitby onto private property, hoping he'd kick the deer out of the scrub and back towards the public game area. But a few minutes after Chris had gone to the cornfield after the deer, Jeff Titus had marched him right out again. Titus had been carrying a shotgun, but it was crossed over his chest so they could push his way through the cornfield. He never pointed the gun at anyone, Holt said. Andrew Holt told me that he knew this event must have been embarrassing for Chris, because it had certainly been embarrassing for him and Clayton. Here they were, he said, the two adults, and they got caught encouraging the youngster in the group to do something they knew wasn't right. It would have been one thing if it had gotten ugly, Andrew Holt said, but it hadn't. They were in the wrong, and they had egg on their face. I asked Andrew Holt, if Titus had been pointing a shotgun at Chris, would you have been able to see that? Yeah, he said. He would have seen it. And if he had seen it, things would have gone very, very different. He told me, Titus wouldn't have gotten away with that. Not with Clayton, not with Ted, not with me. There would have been some immediate accountability. I did time for thumping people's heads, so it's not like an ass whooping would have been something new to me. And if he'd brought Chris out at gunpoint, it would have gotten ugly fast. Jeff Titus's attorneys had known about Andrew Holt. They had a copy of the statement that he'd given to the police, the one the cold case detectives had deemed benign. They had known that Andrew Holt could have contradicted the testimony from Chris and Ted Whitby about how Titus had pointed a gun at Chris, and only pointed the gun away again when Holt had confronted him about it. The defense did not call Andrew Holt to testify, though. I'm not sure why. There's something else, too, that, for some reason, Titus's defense attorneys never brought up at his trial. From what the jury heard, they would have assumed that Ted and Chris Whitby were just another group of hunters with yet another encounter with Jeff Titus. The jury would have assumed, reasonably, that they were just neutral witnesses, with no other connections to the case. But Ted Whitby was not just another witness who'd been discovered by the cold case team. The cold case team hadn't found Ted Whitby at all. He'd come forward to them after Jeff Titus's arrest. And Ted Whitby had been friends with Doug Estes. They'd gone to high school together. Ted also knew Doug's wife, Jan, and they were friends as well. Ted Whitby's friend had been murdered, and he wanted the man that he believed murdered his friend to be punished for it, which means that Ted Whitby had a personal stake in the outcome of the trial that he was testifying at as a witness. In weighing the credibility of Ted and Chris Whitby, that's something the jury should have been made aware of. They never were, though. Neither the prosecution nor the defense ever brought it up. The fourth and final 404B witness was Dale Beatty. In the records I have from the defense's case file, Dale Beatty is mentioned only a couple of times, and never at all in any of the records from the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Office. Beatty's first appearance in the record is not until February 2002, when the prosecutor filed an amended notice of intent to introduce Dale Beatty's testimony as evidence of other acts by Jeff Titus. The first time I'd reviewed this amended notice, I'd been with Jacinda. We'd been going over the 404B witnesses that we'd wanted to ask Jeff Titus about in an upcoming call. Dale Beatty. We have Beatty. What was Beatty's story? Let's see. Beatty was not even found until, later on in 2002, after his arrest. Oh yeah, where did the cold case team dig up this dude? Okay, Mr. Beatty states he was hunting on the Fulton State game property about 92 or 93. He was approached by a person who later learned was Jeff Titus. Titus was dressed totally in camouflage, having no orange whatsoever. Titus told him to leave the area. Beatty felt threatened by the tone of Titus's voice, in particular after Titus told me, "You know guys have been known to be shot out in the woods." Beatty took this as a threat, and he switched the safety off his own shotgun and said, that shit works both ways, get the hell out of here. Please, come on, Mr. Tough Guy. That is not how this exchange went down. Mr. Beatty then left the woods and reported the incident to the Kalamazoo Sheriff's Department.
That's like a great line for a movie.
Yeah.
Right? Like you see the safety. That shit works both ways.
Get the hell out of here. And then Beatty lives. Oh, please, come on. Pursuant to a 15-year retention schedule, the Kalamazoo County Clerk's Office has destroyed all the video recordings of Jeff Titus' trial. Which is unfortunate for a lot of reasons, but what I think I may be saddest about is how I'll never get to see now how Dale Beatty delivered this last line at Titus' trial. Did he actually manage to say it with a straight face? I'm skeptical. In his testimony, Dale Beatty told the court that when Titus had walked up to him and told him to leave, Beatty could see the way Titus was looking at him, and it made Beatty nervous. And then Dale Beatty testified, and I quote, I had my shotgun laying on my lap, and I flipped it off safety where he could hear it. And I told him, that shit works both ways. Get the hell away from me. According to Dale Beatty, Jeff Titus had been so thoroughly intimidated by this that he didn't say another word. Instead, Titus had turned and quietly slunk away back to his field, leaving Dale Beatty to continue hunting in the game area. Okay, but out of all the things that have never happened, this one never happened the most. And what's so frustrating about it is that there's so little to go on here, beyond the prosecutor's amended notice. Even though it seems like there should have been more records. So Beatty says he reported this to the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Department. Where is that report?
I haven't seen that.
There is no report to the Sheriff's Department that I've seen, either from Beatty's encounter in 1992 or the one that happened a year or two later. Because, you see, Beatty had gone back there to hunt again, to the exact same spot. And he told the jury that, once again, he'd encountered a man in the woods. Only this time, the man was wearing all camouflage with streaks of camouflage on his face and had on a camouflage mask. He was also carrying an assault rifle with a banana clip. And, Dale Beatty heavily implies, this man was Jeff Titus. Though he can't actually identify him, given the whole camo face paint and mask thing. Oh yeah, and in case you're wondering, like I was, a banana clip is a curved magazine. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to see on something like an AK-47 in an over-the-top Hollywood action film. It's not something you'd ever use for deer hunting. So yeah, I had doubts about this entire Dale Beatty situation. But for a while, I'd really struggled with how to investigate any further. Dale Beatty passed away 2 years ago, so I couldn't ask him about it. And the defense had never even tried to talk to him. I had no records of any interviews he'd given to the police, nor any records from the reports he said he'd made when the encounters had first happened. And for this event, Jeff Titus couldn't help me out either, because he doesn't remember Dale Beatty, or ever encountering him in the woods. I was stuck. Then I got a chance to go into the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Office and review their file. There, tucked down to the bottom of a manila folder that was unlabeled, I found some old scraps of paper. It was a kite, a letter from an inmate written to one of the guards. To Sergeant, the kite's outer envelope read, Urgent, note inside. The kite was from Kenneth Beatty, the son of Dale Beatty. It was dated December 17th, 2001, 5 days after Jeff Titus' arrest, and it contained the following message.
To whom it may concern concerning the Jeff Titus case. I am Kenneth Beatty and would like to talk to the detective I talked to in my house in late 2000 concerning some information on a suspect, Jeff Titus, before he was charged. The detective came to my house and spoke with me and my father, Dale Beatty. We told the detective how Titus harassed us when we went hunting on his property, state game, that was butted up next to Jeff's land. He, Jeff, hunted in camouflage, no orange, and when my father shot a deer and the deer ran on Jeff's property, and when my father went to get it, a man in camo was hiding behind a tree and was holding an assault rifle with a banana clip and told my father to get the fuck off his property. And there were other different confrontations with us and Jeff in different years of hunting season. I am serving a year's sentence. I have served 9.5 months and my release day is January 7th, 2001. I would really like to spend the holidays with my family and will go to court to testify on the way he, Jeff, harassed me and my father and how territorial he is when it came to his land. My father will also testify on the many occasions him and Jeff had confrontations and how Jeff brought up the fact that 2 people had been killed in the woods and my dad took his safety off his shotgun and said to Jeff that it can happen both ways. So if there's anything you can do to help me get an early release to be with my family for the holidays, me and my father will gladly come to court and testify to his harassing us and how territorial Jeff is.
After leaving the sheriff's office that day, I called up Dale Beatty's son, Kenneth.
Yeah, so your name came in the case file for a guy named Jeff Titus. There were some murders out at the Fulton State game area.
Yeah. I think it was my dad that was the witness.
I believe your dad testified at the trial,
Mm-hmm.
but I think the cops talked to you as well?
Yeah, because he threatened, he told us we were on his land and we needed to get off.
When did that happen? Right about when?
I'm not sure what year it was.
Okay. Were you like...
It had to be before 2001.
How often did y'all go out to the Fulton State game area?
Every year with the hunt.
Kenneth Beatty told me that he too had encountered Jeff Titus in the Fulton game area, though unfortunately, after this many years, he didn't recall too many details.
So what happened when you encountered Titus?
I think we were, me and, I don't know if it was my brother or a friend, we just got done hunting. We were going to our car, and he walked up on us and told us that we were on his land, but state game, we've been hunting there for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we called the police then and told them that he had threatened us.
Oh, you called the police when it happened?
Yeah.
Do you know which police you called by any chance?
No, I don't know.
Got it. So you were there with, who were you with, your brother?
I was either my brother or a friend. That's only one people I went with.
Was your dad
or
there?
My dad, but I don't think he was there that day.
In his kite, Kenneth Beatty had written that he'd actually been interviewed by the cold case team about this incident sometime at the end of 2000. But I've seen no records whatsoever that confirm such an interview really did occur. If it did happen, the defense was never told about it. But without that report, if it does exist, I have no way of learning more about the event that Kenneth Beatty described, or to know if he really had good reason to think that it really had involved Jeff Titus. What Kenneth Beatty had been able to tell me was that the event he was describing had not been with his dad. His dad testified about something else.
So what was your dad's encounter with Titus?
I don't remember.
But you knew he testified at the trial?
Yeah.
Okay. Did he ever talk to you about it, or?
No. I think, well, yeah, he said that there were some people out hunting. They didn't have no hunting gear on. They were all in black, and they had like a banana clip rifle, and scared the crap out of them.
When'd your dad talk to the cops, do you know?
I don't know.
Okay.
The most important question I had for Kenneth Beatty was about the kite he'd written. What I'd most wanted to know was whether his dad had ever known about it.
Do you recall ever reaching out to the police about this, like years after it happened?
No, I don't know.
Okay. Do you ever recall, while in jail, writing a letter to the police about it, maybe?
Maybe, I don't know.
So I think they're in the file.
That's as far as I got before Kenneth Beatty hung up on me. He wouldn't answer any further questions. So I don't know exactly what happened after the guard received that kite from Kenneth Beatty in December of 2001. What I do know is that in February of 2002, Prosecutor Scott Brower filed an amended notice of intent to introduce other acts of evidence and added Dale Beatty to his list of witnesses who would testify about encounters they'd had with Jeff Titus. And I presume, but do not know for sure, that it was Kenneth Beatty's kite that led to Prosecutor Scott Brower learning about Dale Beatty, and that, at least according to Dale Beatty's son, he was someone who'd be glad to testify against Jeff Titus in exchange for his son receiving early release from jail. I don't know if Kenneth Beatty got to go home to his family that Christmas. And I don't know if he received any kind of special treatment after his father agreed to testify. Maybe he didn't get anything. Maybe that's why Prosecutor Scott Brower felt like he didn't need to tell Titus's defense about Kenneth Beatty's kite. But even if Kenneth Beatty never got a thing, I do think the jury should have been able to hear about the request that he'd made, and how he'd conditioned his dad's willingness to testify on the request being granted. Because the jury had believed Dale Beatty, fully believed him. Remember what the juror described earlier about Titus kicking people out of the woods dressed in combat gear? The only witness that could have come from is Dale Beatty.
One encounter was he was in the National Guard, so he had his camouflage clothing. He was all face painted up camouflage, and he had an AR rifle, an assault rifle with him. And he was going around finding...
I wonder, though, would this juror have still believed Dale Beatty if he'd known the detectives first learned of a story when Dale Beatty's son had written to them from jail to tell them that his dad would testify against Titus in exchange for early release? Would Dale Beatty's tale about Titus and the banana clip rifle still seem as credible if the jury had been able to read Kenneth Beatty's kite? Maybe. Then again, maybe not. But that should have been the jury's call to make after hearing all the relevant evidence. And once again, they weren't given the chance. The testimony from these 404B witnesses about Jeff Titus's 4 other acts was used to prove that he had the motive and intent to kill Doug Estes and Jim Bennett, and that their murders had been part of a common scheme, plan, or system. There'd actually been a 5th other act, though, that the prosecution had wanted to introduce at Jeff Titus's trial. There was another 404B witness who came forward after Titus's arrest, and who described how on 2 occasions, a year apart, he'd been in the game area when a man had approached him and tried to scare him off. The first time, the man had pointed a Smith & Wesson revolver at him and then screamed, "I'm sick of you fucking bastards being on my property." The second time, the man had been carrying a .22 caliber rifle and again told him to leave. The judge did not allow the prosecution to call this 404B witness at Jeff Titus's trial. The area where the witness said these encounters had occurred was several hundred yards from Titus's property, and the witness had not been able to pick out Jeff Titus at a lineup. Actually, he'd picked someone else out of the lineup and said that was the man who'd pointed the gun at him. Which is why the prosecution wasn't allowed to call him as a witness at the trial, because it really didn't seem like he was talking about Jeff Titus. Of course, that also means the jury never got to hear that there was someone else apparently going around the game area and threatening hunters and pointing firearms at them. Actually, there were a lot of stories the jury never heard. Stories like this one, from a witness who told us about a time that he and some friends had been out in the game area pushing deer.
Our friend Mark was walking along that guy Titus's property or whatever, and he come out of his tree stand all pissed off, and he marched Mark from the state land across his property out to 46th Street, because we were doing like a deer drive walking through there, and we got to the other side and there was no Mark. We're like, what the heck? So we went walked back through, still no Mark. Well, he was on the other side of the block walking back to the cars because that Titus or whatever, and he had problems with people wandering off state land onto his land, and then he was just kind of a real jerk.
This witness had also been hunting at the Fulton game area on the day of the murders back in 1990, which is one of the reasons why the cold case team had gone out to talk to him. But this particular story about a different hunting trip that had taken place years later is not a story that Jacinda and I had ever heard of before.
Okay, 1. Let's see. I love witnesses like that like you think they're probably not going to be.
And he is a wealth of information.
You're like, oh, okay, so now.
The witness said he'd told the cold case team the same story about how Titus had marched his friend out of the game area and onto the road. But there's nothing about it in the cold case team's report. They left it out entirely. And it had been Detective Mike Brown who interviewed this witness. That's the cold case detective who never once doubted Titus's guilt.
Wait, writing down the bit about his friend being
marched off at gunpoint.
Right. So you don't think he was talking about Titus?
Do you see Mike Brown getting that story and not writing it down?
No, there's no way that story would not be written down if it was absolutely sure it was Titus, or
even thought it could have been Titus.
Thought it could be Titus.
But guess when they're not writing it down? If it ain't about Titus.
If I were to guess why the cold case team had left the story about Jeff Titus and the hunter out of its report, well, I'd say it's probably because of how the witness described the location of where it happened.
Because he had a big stand back there, like up off the ground. It was like 4 or 5 guys could sit in there. And he always had a bunch of guys out there, and they'd shoot anything that come through there. But he had it was probably about 16 foot off the ground. It was a big long box on stilts, and they had a bunch of windows. It was like a gauntlet down through there, because it's a pinch point here. It's so swampy in there, you can't. There's like bogs and quicksands, like where you could just go down and.
Yeah. Jeff Titus's property doesn't overlap the swamp, and I know the pinch point the witness is referring to. It's somewhere else. More importantly, Jeff Titus does not have a fancy tricked-out deer box. Jeff did have deer stands on his property, but they were more like a ledge nailed into a tree. You might get 2 people on it, but they're gonna have to get real cozy to do so.
I feel like someone would have mentioned them partying and hanging in this.
Listen, if Titus had a stand,
If Titus had enough friends that like party in this,
that he could sit in and pick off hunters that came close, everyone would be talking about it.
Everyone wouldn't just have been talking about it either. They'd have been testifying about it too, at Jeff Titus's trial. But that didn't happen.
He couldn't have been talking about Titus.
because the police would have written that down and called him into trial.
Yeah.
There's someone back in the woods not too far from Titus who marched people off at gunpoint.
And it's not Titus.
And it's not Titus, my God.
I want to be clear here. Telling trespassing hunters to get off your property, and even marching them off your property to make sure they go, is in no way evidence of murder. At all. It's just not. And I do not think this event with the hunter and the blinged out deer stand is in any way related to the murder of Doug Estes and Jim Bennett. But I do think it's related to how the prosecution was able to get a conviction against Jeff Titus.
I can't believe he didn't write that down. That's crazy.
Well, they didn't tell anyone about Alan Davis going around shooting his gun at people either.
There are so many stories out there about people having tense encounters in the Fulton game area. But because Jeff Titus was convicted of killing Jim Bennett and Doug Estes, most of these stories have now become Jeff Titus stories. Like the one guy I talked to, who casually mentioned that he too encountered Titus once. He'd been out in the game area with a friend one night when Jeff Titus suddenly appeared out of the dark and started yelling at them to get off the property. I asked him when this had happened, and he said, around 1978 or so. That's 12 years before Jeff Titus moved into the farm that bordered the game area. There's no way it was him. And all these stories and rumors about things Jeff did or said, or supposedly did or said, they've been passed around for decades now. Stories that have changed with each retelling and changed with the passage of time. Stories that then became evidence to be used against Jeff Titus at his trial. Next time on Undisclosed. Thanks for listening to episode 7 of Undisclosed, The State vs. Jeff Titus. This is also our mid-season break, and we'll be off air during the holidays, but we're back in 2021 with episode 8. And there's an addendum episode this Thursday, so send us your questions with the hashtag UDAddendum. Amith Telhan is our executive producer. Our logo was designed by Baluki, and our theme music is by Ramiro Marquez. Audio production was done by Rebecca Lavoie of Partners in Crime Media and host of the Crime Writers On podcast. And music from this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. Transcripts for episodes are available on our website at undisclosed-podcast.com. They're brought to you by our amazing transcript team, Dom Logus, Britta Bliss, Skylar Park, and Eric Fladell. And of course, thank you to our sponsors for making it possible for us to come back week after week. You can follow us online, and on all social media, our handle is @undisclosedpod. We're at Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if any of our listeners out there have information on Jeff Titus's case that they'd like to share, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at undisclosedpodcast@gmail.com, or you can call and leave a message at 410-205-5563. That's all for this week, and thanks so much for listening.